Good morning, everybody, and welcome back again to Deerfield Baptist Church. As we are continuing to go through the book of Matthew, specifically going over the different parables and passages where Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven and kind of what that looks like as we do go through the gospel accounts into Easter. And so that's what we are going to be discussing for the next few weeks still. And as you can see, Lola is a little bit more front and center than normal because I've had it requested that mentioned to me that you guys look for her from time to time in the videos, and so I wanted to make sure that she was going to be more involved today. And if I move my hand, she's going to follow it. It's great. But yeah, so we are going to be continuing through the parables today, and the two specific parables are the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. And I think it's important that Jesus uses these two things because I don't know what you know about parables in general, but Jesus uses things that the people in his audience would understand in order to get stories across to them, which would be like me telling you guys a story about triumph and victory by using the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl. Or by, just telling stories based on the things that we have in common and that we know in common. That's what parables are all about. And so Jesus knows his audience and he tells stories based on things that they will understand so that they can better understand what the kingdom of heaven is and what the kingdom of heaven means. And so that's kind of what the whole point of the parables is. And so he's specifically referencing things here, such as farming and gardening, and then baking with today's parables. So that's what we are going to be discussing today, the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. So, if you would like to follow along, we're going to hit the passage really hard, real quick. And then we're going to go over a few different things in the passage that I think are important for us to note, or at least a few things mentioned in the passage, even just offhand, that are very crucial to ministry, to the gospel, and to what it means to follow Jesus, I believe. So let's go ahead and dive on into the passage. It's Matthew, again, like I said, chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. And it says, "He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches." He told them still another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough." Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet: "I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world." So when Jesus is going through and telling these parables, there are three things that I think are important for us to note. The first is that Jesus um, is mentioned more often throughout Matthew than the other Gospels, about twice as much throughout Matthew as the other Gospels. It's mentioned that Jesus fulfills prophecy. And I think that's important to notice because we've talked about this before, how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, the prophets, and everything else that the Bible is building up to, that the story of God is building up to, is Jesus. He fulfills it. He go like the story of Israel, the story of the people of God from creation to really till Jesus. He kind of goes through again and is the perfection and the completion of that story. And so I think it's important again here that Matthew uh, really brings in the fact that Jesus references or at least fulfills the prophets. And I think that this is where it's important for us as Christians to not become just like yes, we are New Testament Christians and that it is because of the New Testament, it's because of Jesus, it's because of the gospel that we can be part of the kingdom of God, that we can be called children of God. That's why we are able to be part of the kingdom. However, I think that a lot of the times what we do is we like to live in the New Testament. Sure, we'll bring up Genesis once in a while to talk about the creation and the fall and the flood and things like that. We'll go to Exodus to talk about the Ten Commandments and to talk about, Moses bringing the Israelites out of captivity, or God bringing the Israelites out of captivity through Moses. We'll do those things. But then we'll just kind of avoid a lot of the rest of it. Maybe we'll talk about David and Goliath once in a while. Maybe we'll do things like that. But we generally kind of avoid the Old Testament because it's weird and it's hard, and there's things in there that don't make sense to us. And there's an entire book that's just genealogies, and there's another book that's just laws and rules and regulations for how to worship and how to build tents and how to do all of these things. And oftentimes we just like to avoid it. But I believe that it's true that you cannot fully grasp the beauty, you cannot fully grasp the gravity of what's happening in the New Testament if you don't first have some understanding of the Old Testament. And I would recommend that we all spend more time in the Old Testament, that we spend time in the whole Bible, so that we can have a full picture of the beauty and the grace that God offers to us. I think that that's important for us. Now, I will also say, if you've never read the Bible before, if you've never read any of it, I would start in the Gospels. Specifically, I would probably start with Mark or John, depending on kind of what you're trying to get into. But I would start there and then work your way around. And I don't think there's a perfect or one size fits all way to do it. I'm currently trying to read my way through it in order, like from cover to cover, which is something I've never completed. And so I'm trying to do that right now. And going through the Old Testament, knowing the gospel and understanding a lot of the New Testament really just makes a lot of that more beautiful for me. And I think it will for you too. And so, like Matthew here, a lot of Matthew is references to the Old Testament. It's references, allusions, and direct quotations from the Old Testament. Again, this isn't the point of the parable here, but I just really want to defend the Old Testament to you because I think, like I said, I think we like to ignore it. I think we like to skip it and go straight to the Gospels. And I just think that there's a lot of beauty we miss out on when we do that. So yeah, check out the Old Testament. It's a good book. The second thing is that Jesus uses two parables in this example. He uses the parable of the mustard seed and he uses the parable of the leaven. Now, he uses two occupations that would typically be done by different people. He uses farming and gardening, which is typically done by men, and he uses baking, which is typically done by women in their culture. And I think this shows a couple of things. First, this shows that Jesus is trying to help everybody in the crowd, no matter what they do, no matter what kinds of occupations or experiences they have, they can understand what he's saying a little bit more. He uses parables that match the people in the crowd. Also, I think this is important because Jesus teaches both men and women, and we see that throughout the gospel accounts. Because when we've got Mary and Martha, who are both reacting differently to Jesus in the home, one sits at his feet, one is diligently cleaning, and Jesus says, no, the one who sits at my feet, like, you're doing right. And I think that, like, Jesus taught women, and that's something that a lot of teachers of the day wouldn't do. And I think it's important because Jesus doesn't like choose the social boundaries that we choose as far as like who can be taught the good news, who can be taught about the kingdom. And so, like, if there are any arbitrary walls that we set up as to who's allowed to come hear the gospel, or who's allowed to be part of church, or who's allowed to, be there for any kind of teaching, that's completely made by man and sinful. Now, there are guidelines that are very clearly stated in First Timothy and Titus about who can be like teachers. And I think Paul is pretty clear about that. Jesus is pretty clear that teachers ought to be people who are held to a higher standard and who do live according to his word. Um, but you don't have to be a teacher to go to church. And I think that, like, we tend to close people out from church, from being part of the body, um, who shouldn't be closed out, because we build up these walls where, like, oh, you voted this way, you can't go to church, or oh, you feel that way about a certain topic, you can't be part of our church, or something like that. And that's not the message that we hear. That Jesus breaks down these societal walls that we build up, and he teaches whoever comes to him. And I think that if we're going to be like Jesus, we ought to teach whoever comes to us the good news of Jesus Christ. And he will do the rest. He will do the work in their hearts. That's not our job. Our job is to tell them who he is and what he's done. Just a thought. And so that's kind of the second thing, is he tells these parables for anybody who's present to be able to understand what he's saying. And then the third thing is the message of the parable themselves, and it's a message of small beginnings. Now, I don't think like great reward or great reaping from small beginnings. And I don't think we need to look just in the church to see this happen. A good example, some secular examples here, I think we can look to Rosa Parks. And I would argue the church was very involved in the civil rights movement, but it started, not technically fully started, but we can point to as a pretty good beginning point to the civil rights movement as Rosa Parks refusing to move in the bus. Um, and I think that that moment kind of sparked a revolution that became the civil rights movement and was all over the country and in turn all over the Western world. Then we have other examples like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who were building personal computers in their garage, and everybody thought they were insane for doing something like that. And before he died, Steve Jobs saw that Apple was one of the biggest companies in all of history, which is insane to think about. Like, that's a very small beginning, and something huge came from it. And another example, Mikhail Gorbachev, which is a name that I'm not incredibly familiar with. I mean, I am because of history, but like, he did everything he did before I was really alive or had consciousness. But he was critical in the Iron Curtain falling in the Soviet era because of because he was one of the first people to take a stand against all the anti-Western rhetoric. And he had certain policies that he enacted, and this man in small beginnings ultimately led to not the downfall necessarily, but kind of the end of the Soviet era. And then we can look to Christian, like strictly church happenings. I mean, we've got Martin Luther in putting the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, which is a very small place. And that was the same thing that most people did, is that like a lot of people look at that and like, oh, he nailed something to the church door. That was basically like the posting site. Like that was the Facebook wall of the day, is like if people had a job posting, if people wanted to put news out there, if people needed assistance with something, or they wanted to offer assistance with something, they would nail it to the church door. So that wasn't a huge deal, but he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, and we can really point to that as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Although there were obviously other cogs involved in that, but Martin Luther, just this priest and college professor, uh, putting these 95 Theses on the church door led to something international. And the churches that we were a part of would not exist without this. No, I think ultimately they would, to a degree, because I think that Reformation was on the way anyways, and it ended up happening within the Catholic Church a few years later, within a couple of decades of the Protestant Reformation. However, that's for another discussion on church history, not for today. And then we have the example of like Christianity in restricted areas. I'm thinking specifically places like China, where it is illegal to be a Christian. You can have your property seized, you can be arrested, you can even be killed for preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ in a lot of these countries. And yet the church explodes based on the faithfulness of a few believers. Um, it's just insane that like small beginnings lead to great things. And then we go all the way back to the beginning of the church, and we've got Jesus and his 12 disciples. And Jesus and these 12 disciples started a movement that has involved billions of people throughout human history, being the church. And I think that that's insane. And I think that that's crazy that God will use little beginnings to do giant things. And I think one of the greatest examples of this that we can see in the gospel, other than just the gospels themselves, other than the disciples, other than what Jesus did, but like we can see a good example of this in Jesus feeding the 5,000. What he does is he asks his disciples to gather some food, and they get 5 loaves and some fish, 2 fish. And they're able to feed thousands of people and have a ton of leftover food with it, with some kids' lunch. And I think that, like, when we look at that story, when we look at this parable, when we look at these things, like, you and I may not have much to offer. We might not. And I don't mean when we talk about like 10% of our money. I don't mean when I talk about like our talents or our time or anything like that. When I'm talking about that, I'm talking about ourselves, because that's ultimately what we're called to do. We're called to offer ourselves to Christ. When he says to pick up a cross and deny ourselves, he's not saying that, like, oh, you need to just live self sacrificially. He's saying, no, give yourself over in life and death to me. That's what we're called to do. And so we may not be much, we may not have much in what we offer him, but God can do amazing things with the little things that are given to him in faith. So my encouragement to you, and what I believe that this passage is telling the people to do in the kingdom, when we have little to offer, God can do amazing things with it still. So give yourself. Give yourself to the kingdom. Give yourself to Jesus. And even though you may not see what's possible, he does. And he will do amazing things in and through you if you give yourself over to him in faith. Would you please pray with me? Father, you are good. Thank you for another opportunity to dive into your word today, to dig into the parables and to understand a little bit more about the kingdom, and how part of being in this kingdom means that even if we have little to offer, you can do amazing things through it. And there are so many examples where little that is given amounts to great things in you. God, let us be a people who do give ourselves to you in faith, who do give what we have, and who are faithful, even if by our own standards it doesn't seem like great things are happening, just that we know that we are being faithful to what you've called us to do. Thank you for letting us be citizens in your kingdom. Thank you for giving us new life in Jesus, and thank you for every day that we get to show your love to those around us. It is in your precious and holy name that we pray. Amen. Okay. Thank you, guys. I love you. Have a great week, and just continue doing what God calls you to. See you later.